All right, good morning, Chair Postman, members, Garrett, Vollendorf, staff, and guests. The lobbies are open. Recording has begun.
Thanks, Dustin. Good morning, everybody. We'll convene the board caucus meeting for Tuesday, September 5th, 2023. Today, we're going to talk about agency request legislation, or I shall say draft proposals for agency request legislation. We're joined here by Justin Nordhorn, Policy and External Affairs Director. Justin and Mark Webster, Ledge Director, have been hard at work on all this. So, Justin, I'll turn it over to you if you want to walk us through the two we're looking at.
Sure. Good morning, Chair Postman, members Garrett and Vollendorf. So today we are trying to get to a decision point on what we want to move forward, if anything, to the legislature or through the governor's office for consideration for a potential legislative proposal from the agency. So we started off with three different proposals, as you know. The first one was contract growing for medical patients, where we were going to have producers be able to extend their provisions right now and afford patients an opportunity to contract for them so they don't have to grow at home. We had a significant amount of feedback from a number of groups and individuals on that particular proposal. None of them were very supportive of it. They wanted to look at different avenues of trying to get to similar benefits for patients. And so we had basically decided that that one's not worth moving forward into this consideration even. So I just wanted you to be aware that that one's kind of been tabled because there was just no support for that particular concept. So the next one I want to talk about, I'm going to shift into the liquor area because this one we received far fewer comments on. So we have a proposed concept that would basically take our furnishing liquor to minors statute and adopt the furnishing tobacco to minors statutory language into the liquor language. And so it would create an administrative option so our staff would not necessarily need to cite clerks at grocery stores criminally for a sale to a minor. And then this way, we would have a sliding scale or a progressive scale, I should say, within statute, just like we have for tobacco. It does not take away the ability to issue criminal citations if appropriate. For example, if there's any type of intentional sale that we see, we've had it in the past where our investigative aides are going to tell you the truth. And so somebody is asked, are you 21? Our investigative aide said no. And they said, well, be careful with this. So that might be one of those situations that that intent really meets a criminal level. But if you misread the ID, do we want to create criminal records for folks? And do we want to also have the 39 different district courts across the state choose to do things however they want to prioritize? We're going to have a different result out of those 39 particular districts. So in some areas of the state, we see folks that get really very stiff penalties, over $1,000 fine, whereas other counties in the state, we see deferrals, we see prosecution, so they just decide not to even file. And so there's zero accountability for the clerk. And a lot of that has to do with different levels of workload that the prosecutor's office has. And they certainly look at these. And so in order to increase the level of accountability and consistent accountability across the state, this particular proposal would create that administrative avenue like we have in tobacco, where the clerks would be held accountable at the same level in all parts of the state. And then they would go through the administrative process, which would also afford them the opportunity to handle this without a criminal history being created for them in this particular area. Subsequent violations could end up with a criminal sanction if there's cause for that, particularly if they're doing multiple or repeat violations in short periods of time. But it does have that structure. So hopefully that when a clerk engages in the administrative sanction process, they would have the opportunity to go through even a training class on their first offense. So we get them trained and hopefully they become the better employee and not have this happen again. We don't get those same opportunities in the criminal sanction approach on mandating that type of training. So overall, this particular proposal did not have many comments. We did have some folks say it didn't have any impact on them. We had some industry say this looks fine. We did have some interest points from others that thought that this kind of goes away from where it should be. Having the seriousness of selling alcohol to minors should be a criminal offense. And so folks, there were some people who felt strongly that that is the more appropriate penalty and sanction. But again, we don't always have the same level of adjudication across the state in the different areas. So I wanted you to be aware that there was some countering opinions on that as well. But this particular one is fairly straightforward, adopting language in the tobacco statutes and then mirroring the penalty levels with the mandatory alcohol server permits that we have. And so if you're a bartender or a clerk in a store, you would have the same level of penalty. So there wouldn't be differentiation, which we see between the criminal system and the administrative system right now. So yeah, any questions on that before I move into the next one? And we can figure out whether we want to move forward. I don't think this really requires a board action. It's just, are you comfortable with these concepts? And if not, then, you know, we need to know that.
Questions for Justin on this one? Jim? Muted. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sure can.
Sorry about that. I
Sure.
don't have any questions about it, but I do have a comment. So do you want to take the comments just at the end, or do you want me to comment on this one?
Let's do this
Now.
one first and then we'll do the second one. Yeah, let's go
Okay.
ahead, dig into this
Uh,
one.
This one here, you know, I think of the in terms of my role, my personal priorities, keeping product out of the hands of young people is incredibly important, and I think board members and the retailers, everybody I talk to agrees with that. And I've been known to say, and I think some people disagree with me, but I do think that sales to minors is preventable. And one of the ways that we can do that is make sure that we are putting everything in place to help our retailers. And for me, I think this is a help to retailers. This is a way to take their employees and hold them accountable as opposed to just the retailer. I appreciate the fact that the ways in which district courts handle this around the state are so inconsistent that there's really not a lot of teeth in the current process. And this might be a way for us to put some parameters that would decrease sales to minors, or at least hold employees individually accountable. And not like, and Justin pointed out, we're not trying to create criminal records for people. This is about providing opportunities for holding people accountable under a civil process, and give people opportunities to take classes. And so anyway, I really support this proposal.
Yeah, I would say, I think, you know, what it does is it replaces theoretical criminal charges with real administrative penalties. So I think it's going to end up being stricter than the existing thing, even though we are moving to an option of non-criminal. And I think that's a good step. And when I first learned that we were referring clerks for criminal prosecution, when sometimes the business owner was, you know, getting off with a couple $100 fine, that didn't sit well with me either. I thought we were almost too hard on the clerk there who creates a criminal record, whereas the store that's in. So I think we should do this bill, but I think, because I agree with Jim, they are preventable almost always. And alcohol sales could be better than they are on a percent basis from what we see with our compliance checks. And I think the board needs to really look at how we frankly get a little more maybe stringent on the licensee side too, because we've talked about this somewhat, but you know, when you see repeat offenses with different clerks, but in the same store, I think that raises questions for me about the operations of that store and whether they're training people properly and everything else. So I think we should do this, but I think we need and we've started some of these conversations, but we really need to look at the whole process for compliance checks and penalties and fines and compromises and settlements and all the things that are part of that system, and try to ramp that up a little bit. I mean, alcohol could be better on a percent basis, I think. So.
Yep.
Yeah, my
I have one other question, and Justin, you may have answered this, and I apologize if I missed it. And maybe I should know this, just having been on the board for over a year. I can't use the new guy thing any longer. However, so this is mirrored after tobacco. This is for alcohol. What does this look like on the cannabis side? And have we considered that, or is that just not something that we're considering at this point? And if not, why?
Yeah, so we have not provided consideration on the cannabis side yet on this type of approach. And part of the reason is when cannabis was first legalized in our state, the sales to a minor penalty was a felony. And we did actually see some county jurisdictions prosecute at the felony level for sales of cannabis to a minor. Since then, there has been legislative changes that indicate if you're a clerk basically in a store and you sell to cannabis to a minor, then it is a gross misdemeanor versus a felony. And yet, if you're just supplying or delivering a controlled substance to a minor, it would still be a felony outside of that store environment. So there has been a change legislatively since the adoption of Initiative 502. And so we haven't really explored loosening that particular area. And also, I think when we look at the need for the compliance rates, cannabis does really well under the current program. Our retailers do a really good job, I think, in their levels of compliance. Whereas the alcohol side, what other tools can we have to try to increase that compliance rate is kind of what we're looking at. I should mention, so I represent the comments that I did get. There was some question around, are we able to track, this ongoing history if there's repeat violations? The answer is yes, because we have that in tobacco already. So we don't need to build a new system or anything like that. That's all a part of how this could work.
That's helpful, and I appreciate the fact. I mean, I don't want anybody to be charged with a felony for selling cannabis to a minor, but is the district courts handling it the cannabis referrals inconsistently as they are on the alcohol side, or what does that look like in the district court system for cannabis?
Yeah, and I don't think that we have good solid data on that, but from what I understand over the last several years, the answer would be similar to alcohol. It varies based on the county. And so, like I said, when we first started and we had felony charges, we saw some of the smaller counties and, charge the store or charge the bud tenders with the felony and go through that process. Whereas other ones did the same thing as in alcohol. They just deferred it because they just didn't have the resources to be able to prosecute anything.
Okay, great. And I appreciate, I mean, we do have very good compliance on the cannabis side. So that's a really good point. However, I will say, and I'm not advocating for this necessarily, but consistency across the programs where it makes sense to me is something we should strive for. And again, I'm not advocating for that, but I am pointing it out that it is an inconsistency.
I think that's a good point. We won't get it into this one for this year, but I'd like to try to find out the answer to Jim's question about what are we seeing for the court action on the cannabis side, so we can look at that going forward. Of course, I think we'd be happy to see alcohol's compliance rate where cannabis is.
Yes.
Maybe we can get there. Michael, what was internal feedback both from enforcement and public health? What did you hear about this?
So this came from staff in both enforcement and public health as a concept. And so they presented to me and I took that on and kind of did the drafting. So public health is definitely in favor internally with not criminally citing the clerks. I think from some of the enforcement staff perspective, it would help with that consistency across the state in all the counties. However, we did have some other folks that are concerned that loosening up or lightening up from a criminal citation into an administrative citation sends a softer message on the importance of youth access compliance. And so I think that's, there's definitely some different viewpoints.
I just don't think in reality it sends that message, though I understand that reaction, because what's happening is nothing. More often than not, there is no follow-up.
Yeah,
This is,
I agree.
Ali,
Yeah.
and Jim asked the question that I was going to ask, so thank you, Jim. But I'm curious on the cannabis side and the criminal aspect, when the governor passed that of dropping all criminal or criminal charges and different things, doesn't that contradict or conflict with what we're saying, or no?
I don't think so. Because I think
On the cannabis side, if we are referring someone criminal,
I think.
are
the
those
difference-
cases and things like that even being looked at based on that?
Well, can I just say one quick thing? I think one of the big differences we're talking about, one that exists within the state's
Right.
regulated system. The other is
Okay.
outside it. And what he was trying to do was to give relief to those who were prosecuted prior to the legalization of adult
Right.
use cannabis in our state. to
Okay,
try
so
to
it was
even it that
prior.
way.
Okay, all right.
And so I think that's important. The other thing, though, that is a reality, which I know from talking to law enforcement, and you know this better, but that there are some jurisdictions in our state who don't want to do anything related to cannabis, no matter what,
Right.
even inversion and illegal grows and things. And what we hear is, well, you guys legalized it. You know, well, you guys meaning the voters of the state, but you know what I mean? So there is, I think, a reluctance on law enforcement across the board
Right.
to go after cannabis at any level, but within our system, we've got that authority, and I think that
Yeah.
is nominally different.
Right. All right.
Okay, so we got a consensus on this one.
Okay. Moving to the last one, which is cannabis advertising. And so, you know, when Initiative 502 passed and we stood up our rules, we had the year to get those online. And we knew at the time that we were going to start off strict. We were one of the first two in the nation. And then we would intend to lighten up on where we could on the regulatory structure over time, which we haven't really done in the advertising area. So we get a number of complaints in the enforcement division about advertising. I'm not sure if it's still the number one complaint, but for many years it was the top complaint out of everything. And to put that into some context, and I'm kind of going back in time when I was wearing a different hat, but advertising was the number one complaint. Sales to minors was number 8. And so you could see that, you know, this was taking up a ton of time for enforcement staff around the issues. And so there's a number of interest points on how can we continue to maintain a level of regulation with advertising similar to alcohol. So we have a structure without just opening the door wide open, and yet you know, making some allowances so businesses can actually function like other businesses in the state. And so what we're proposing in this particular concept is to increase the number of signs and also redefine kind of what signs would look like. So basically taking out the trade name sign as one of your 2 signs that you can have as your outdoor advertising. Keep advertising in the marketing area and keep the trade name just on the business as a separate sign. 1,600 square inches for a trade name sign is very small. And so we did the research on looking at what are some of the standards. We heard feedback from folks on what they thought would be a good you know, number as far as the size would go. And that's where we had settled on the 7,200 square inches for trade name signs. But we wanted to separate that from the other outdoor advertising signs. From the previous iterations of this particular concept, we did a number of things. And so I won't go through every aspect of the proposal here, but we took out the, and this is all based on feedback from stakeholders. And we got a considerable amount of feedback from stakeholders on this. We took out the billboard distance requirement. So we were going to have the distance 1,000 feet from the store to be able to have a billboard. And that was to be able to mitigate the issues where people are utilizing billboards to get around the 2 signs issue. And so we just heard a lot of folks on feedback on trying to do the measurements distance, and that would potentially complicate issues. So with some of the current investments people have made in these particular billboards and the contracts that they hold, we thought this may not be the issue to debate in this particular proposal. So we removed that particular provision. We also removed a provision that we wanted to provide allowances for businesses to have that trade name as other normal businesses somewhere on their property and not just on the building. And so that's where we introduced the concept of monument and pylon signs. But we wanted to be able to be sure that they didn't have to be attached to the building and they could be out on the peripheral of the area. So we created this definition under this particular subset of a parcel and how that would interact. There were some concerns around the confusion that would create and what that means. And so we actually removed that language out of there and redrafted that. So where we ended up was going from 2 signs to 4 signs for advertising, and then having, in addition to that, trade name signs that would be eligible to be 2 on the building, and an additional pylon or monument sign out in front. And so you'd end up having 7 potential signs total at a cannabis retail location.
Compared to what today?
2. And so we had feedback from industry because we had some incentives built in for extra signage for medical endorsement holders. That was looked upon as confusing, and why not just make it like alcohol? And that came from not only industry members, but also from our public health stakeholders. And so, we compromised in there and said, okay, let's just make it 4 across the board, just like alcohol has. So the age restricted products can be regulated in the same manner. So that's where we ended up with the 4 signs.
But how do you get from 4 to 7? That's where I always get lost.
So you have
different types of signs.
Yeah, so your 4 signs that you can have are 1,600 square inches, and those are essentially your marketing signs. How you're going to market, different aspects of that business. The trade name is simply just that. It's the trade name that is attached on the outside of your business. So you can have 2 of those, and then the one, stone monument sign or the strip mall sign that's out there. So that would be 7. Those 3 plus the 1,600 square inches gives you 7.
And what does alcohol have? That they can.
So
if I'm running a liquor store, can I have 7 signs?
You can.
My trade name and my advertising.
You could probably have more because alcohol doesn't restrict the number of trade name signs. They do say you can only have 1,600 square inch signs, 4 of them for the marketing, but they do not address trade names, and we haven't adopted that in the approach that trade names are considered those signs. So this would bring it more in line, but there is still some concern about visibility and the impacts on social norming and those types of things.
It seems like a lot of signs, is all to me. But I mean, and I do think it's time to evolve this enforcement part of this here. I don't think we should be spending as much time as we have to today on it. I don't know what the right thing to do is. That seems a lot. I understand what you're saying about billboards, though. So I'd be happy to see them go away at some point for everything, but
so we really tried to loosen this up in a number of different ways, and then we also tried to strengthen the areas for the state interest, meaning that your advertising can't be correlated with alcohol, it can't be correlated with tobacco, it can't be correlated with vehicles or driving, and so those types of things we wanted to shore up to make sure that it's very clear. And part of the reason to do this in statute is for the clarity. People want specifics, but then when they see some of the measurements, they're like, well, that's too complicated. Well, you can't have, the specifics and not having it be a little bit complicated together.
You're going to have to measure.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I should call out. So there was a bill last year that is still active in the legislature, and that was Senate Bill 5363. And that had to do with advertising as well. And so there's some comments that have been made around, well, why would you guys propose an advertising bill when there's already one that's active out there? That particular bill basically said the Liquor and Cannabis Board cannot enforce size on signs, and that's it, and give it to the local jurisdictions. It didn't deal with the number of signs. It didn't deal with a number of the other types of interest points. And so it was fairly small in scope. There's been some suggestions that we utilize that vehicle as a method to introduce some of these changes into that bill, so we don't start from square one, since that has already passed the Senate unanimously. It just didn't get out of the House. And so there's that option that's out there. So kind of the question on this is, do we want to propose something to have as a backup to showcase that, the board is interested in looking at some deregulation in this area? Or do we want to potentially use that other current statutory or that current bill proposal as a vehicle? Now, that doesn't mean that we could get amendments in there. It's hard to say, where that would end up. I think if we move forward and presented this to the governor's office for consideration, that doesn't lock us into seeking a sponsor. If we can have some collaboration with industry to figure out what parts of this we'd be able to weave into the existing bill. So I think there's certainly opportunities. We can either commit to doing that, we could present this and move forward for governor's consideration, and then we still have some of those other options. But that's kind of where this is at. There's still some points that folks are calling out that are potential confusion. I'm going to look at that today before we finalize if we're moving forward. If not, then I'm not going to spend any more capacity on that.
Question, Jim, go ahead.
This is in no particular order and somewhat random in my thoughts, but I wanted to put this out there. So one, I think it's a good conversation to have. I think that the conversation itself, now whether this is the right way or avenue, I don't know yet. I do think and tend to believe that stricter cannabis advertising regulations are good public policy. And now I'm not making a judgment whether these do or don't support that statement, but I also want to make sure, and I'm assuming, Justin, that Director Wax and the enforcement and education staff have reviewed this and support, and because I have heard some of the challenges they face out there when they're, in the field and looking at signs and trying to make decisions and all that kind of stuff. So certainly would want them to be on board with this. So yeah, I guess that those are my random thoughts at this point. I don't know what the right thing to do is here, but I do think it's a good conversation for us to be having. Oh, I know one other thing. This might be an opportunity for us to use our new research team to help us work with people who do research on advertising to cannabis advertising in communities, and what does the research tell us, and then look at what the research tells us compared to this proposed legislation and see if they align in a way that supports good public policy.
This is Ollie. I think it's good that we are going to have our own agency request bill that makes it clear. I was here during the time of all of the complaints and everything back with advertising, and heard all of the comments coming to the board, the lack of consistency, people saying you measure from this spot to this spot and the measure should have been this spot to that spot, all of the stuff around that back years ago. So I think this make it clearer. I think what we heard even back then, Jim, that our state had the most strictest requirements for signage. So we've already, that subject has already been years discussed. And from what I understand, and Justin, you can help me with this, that our Washington State had the most strictest signs when it rules when it came to advertising.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, like I said, time to move our thinking on some of these signs and advertising. But well, one thing, we talk about working with industry. I think and I know you are reaching out to Senator McEwen, who's the sponsor of that bill, and see what he's thinking and where there's flexibility. I think we also need to make sure that we keep public health at the table with the industry groups to make sure they're also aware and just participating in that. And we will decide where we land, of course, but I just wanted to make sure they're part of the conversation. I was just thinking about, that this passed the Senate unanimously, of course. So that makes some people think it's one step away from becoming law. Not necessarily, of course. But it is surprising, and I wonder what those senators were thinking. Is it like, what is the message there? Is it the message that, because we would still retain regulation over the content of the sign under the McEwen bill,
And the
right?
number.
And the number. So it's sort of a half step, but gives that enforcement of the sign code to locals. But I don't know, that's the other thing. I think we need to just also keep talking to members and go, well, what are you thinking there? Like, what are you going for? Because
Yeah.
you could see two different people voting for that bill thinking sort of two different approaches about what they're getting from it. The one thing that I think I mentioned before, but just sure that I think would be the worst outcome is, which I know had been considered at one point, a local option for local governments to decide whether they wanted us to do their sign enforcement or they would do their sign enforcement. Because I think that would be paralyzing for our enforcement team. They would have to be looking at the GPS and go, I just moved into King County. What's there? Oh, I'm in Renton. We can't expend
No,
that
I
much time
agree.
and energy on this issue. So when you have those discussions, that's one thing I would we need a unified, seems to me,
I agree.
approach to this.
And they probably was trying to do something based on hearing from the industry and the complaints and different things. And that's the reason I say I think it's good that we're having our own agency request bill, to where what we're putting forth is something we've thought through and trying to weigh both LCB and what the industry was going to the legislators complaining about. Because
Yeah.
this has been a long conversation from
Yeah.
the industry.
I think that it's a bill from us would be a sign that we're open to that kind of deregulation or re-regulation, if you will. But we did hear from some of the industry who were, I guess, sort of offended that we did it. Like, where were you last year? We did this, but
Hey,
no, we can't make
better
everybody
late.
happy.
I was
ever.
gonna say better late than never. And at the same time, back then on the advertising, stores were just opening up and had requirements of where they had to be and on and on. This is years later where
Yeah,
pretty much anybody knows where the stores are now and things.
Well,
So
I was just talking about last session. That was their
Yeah.
conversation with us, was where we left. The other thing, so I don't know if we have a consensus on this bill or not. I think it's fine just to keep working on it and submit it to the governor's office and keep having that conversation. And I would share with the governor's office what we've been talking about here, make sure they know where we stand, if that makes sense to the board.
I'm
at
good
this
with
point. Yeah, so I think we have that consensus. The other thing, though, just throw a stick in the spoke a little bit. I was going to mention at the end of the meeting today, the new WISIP report. I don't know if anybody's had a chance to look at it. We got it last week. This is the third required Washington State Public
Institute for Public Policy. Yeah.
Institute for Public Policy. We're told to do a series of reports on legalization. This is their third report. One thing that's interesting is they because of the pandemic, they cut it off at 2019. So this report is up to 2019, and so it's not fresh in that way. But one of their big takeaways is that they find a connection between a cannabis store in the neighborhood and use, and I believe overuse of cannabis, which I was going to ask on board reports. We should have them in to ask questions about this,
Yeah.
Jim, and I know you've been in touch with them, but let's do that, because that then also raises this question to me. If that's true, and we're saying that people who have a cannabis store in their neighborhood are using more than people elsewhere, how does advertising that store play into that?
Mhm.
I'd
Good
be
question.
really what they had to say about that. I gotta say, when I read the report, I'm still scratching my head about that a little bit. It's not exactly clear to me, the ultimate layperson on this issue, though. How do we know those numbers weren't the same pre-legalization in terms of more dense urban area, or it's an economic area, or whatever it is? I
Right.
don't know what it'd be, but Anyhow.
So just a quick comment on the local control issue. So some of the stakeholders have asked, for locals to have that. And part of the reason behind that is locals usually have some pretty laid out regulations around advertising in their communities. And so they already kind of have that. And that's why I think there's that strong interest point. I think for us, what would be good is for those communities that don't have that, that there's a baseline. And so if the locals want to make something more restrictive, then they certainly can, just like they do in alcohol. We still have a community in Washington, if nothing's changed in the last few years, that still doesn't do Sunday sales of alcohol. But that's not for us to enforce, that's for them to enforce. And so if they're more restrictive than that.
More
that's
restrictive, they
yeah.
can do less.
Correct.
Right.
And so this would give a baseline that if they didn't have any regulations, then here's the state standard.
Okay.
And I think that's where some of the value is added in this type of
That
a
makes
proposal.
sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Anything else?
No, I think I have what I need for the
Okay.
consensus, and
Great.
we'll move these two forward. Thank you.
Good. Thanks. Thanks for all the work on this.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Mark.
appreciate it. Okay, then that takes us to board member and executive assistant reports. Anything from you, Dustin?
No, thank you, Chair.
Jim, Ollie, anything to add?
Nothing.
Okay, great. Then we'll adjourn the caucus meeting for September 5th, 2023, and we will see you all next week.
Thank you.
Have a good day.